Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. This morning we'll be reading from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila, chapter 11, which is entitled the Bera Kirtan Pastimes. And probably we'll stick around the first 10 or 12 verses, and I'll especially emphasize text number 8, which maybe will be on the board. So, Om Ajnanatimanantasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yat Kripatamaham Vande Shri Gurum Dinataranam Vanshakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Want to ask for the blessings of all the Vaishnavas, especially the many senior devotees here. Kindly be merciful upon me and wish me well. This is chapter summary, Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila, chapter 11. The Bera Kirtan Pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur summarizes the 11th chapter in his Amrita Pravaha Bhashya when Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya tried his best to arrange a meeting between Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and King Prataparudra. The Lord flatly denied his request. At this time, Sri Ramananda Rai returned from his governmental post, and he praised King Prataparudra highly in Lord Chaitanya's presence. Because of this, the Lord became a little soft. The king also made promises to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, who hinted how the king might meet the Lord. During Anavasara, while Lord Jagannath was resting for 15 days, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, being unable to see Lord Jagannath, went to Alarnath. Later, when the devotees from Bengal came to see him, he returned to Jagannath Puri. While Advaita Acharya and other devotees were coming to Jagannath Puri, Sarup Damodar and Govinda, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's two personal assistants, went to receive all the devotees with garlands. From the roof of his palace, King Prataparudra could see all the devotees arriving. Gopinath Acharya stood on the roof with the king, and following Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's instructions, identified each and every devotee. The king discussed the devotees with Gopinath Acharya, and he mentioned that the devotees were accepting prasadam without observing the regular principles governing pilgrimages. They accepted prasadam without having shaved, and they neglected to fast in a holy place. After Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya had explained to the king why the devotees had apparently violated the scriptural injunctions for visiting a place of pilgrimage, the king arranged residential quarters for all the devotees and saw to their prasadam. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu talked very happily with Vasudeva Datta and other devotees. Haridas Thakur also came, and due to his humble and submissive attitude, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gave him a nice solitary place near the temple. After this, the Lord began performing Sankirtana, dividing all the devotees into 4 groups. After Sankirtana, all the devotees left for their residential quarters. Atyuddhantam Tandavam Gauda Chandra Kuravan Bhaktai Shri Jagannath Gehe Nana bhavalankritanga swadhamna chakre vishwam prema vanyana. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu merged the entire world into the ocean of ecstatic love by performing his beautiful dances within the temple of Jagannath. He danced exquisitely and jumped high. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gauda Bhakta Vrinda. All glories to Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. All glories to Lord Nityananda Prabhu. All glories to Sri Advaita Prabhu. And all glories to all the devotees of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Aradhino Sharabhabhoma Kahe Prabhu Sthane Abhaidana Deho Jadi Kare Nibedane. The next day, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya requested Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to give him permission to submit a statement without fear. Prabhu kohe kahatumi nahi kichu bhai, yogya kaile karibo, ayogya haile nai. The Lord gave Bhattacharya assurance that he could speak without fear, but added that if his statement were suitable, he would accept it, and if it were not, he would reject it. Sarvabhauma kahe e pratap rudrarai, utkantha haya che toma milibare chai. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya said, there is a king named Pratap Rudrarai. He's very anxious to meet you, and he wants your permission. Karne hasta diye prabhu smare narayan, Sarvabhauma kaha keho, Keno ayogya vachan. As soon as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu heard this proposal, he immediately covered his ears with his hands and said, my dear Sarvabhauma, why are you requesting such an undesirable thing from me? He remembered Narayan while he was doing this, it says. Virakta sanyashyama rajdarashana Sri darashana sama visher bhakhana. Since I'm in the renounced order, it is as dangerous for me to meet a king as to meet a woman. To meet either would be just like drinking poison. Nishkinchanasya bhagavad bhajanonmukhasya Param param jigameshur bhavasagarasya Sandarshanam vishayanam athayoshitam cha Ha hanta hanta vishabhakshana topya sadho. Greatly lamenting, the Lord then informed Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, alas, for a person who is seriously desiring to cross the ocean and engage in the transcendental, loving service of the Lord without material motives, seeing a materialist engaged in sense gratification, or seeing a woman who is similarly interested, is more abominable than drinking poison willingly. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, founder and Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. This is a quotation from Sri Chaitanya Chandrodaya Natak, Act 8, text number 23. Who wrote that book? No. No. And no. Kavi Karnapura. Thus, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu enunciates the principle for a sannyasi, renouncing the material world for spiritual advancement. Spiritual advancement is not meant for magic shows and jugglery, but for crossing the material world and being transferred to the spiritual world. Param param jigamashoho means desiring to go to the other side of the material world. There is a river called Vaitarani, and on one side of this river is the material world, and on the other side is the spiritual world. Since the Vaitarani river is compared to a great ocean, it's named Bhavasagar, the ocean of repeated birth and death. Spiritual life aims at stopping this repetition of birth and death and entering into the spiritual world, where one can live eternally, cognizant, and blissful. Unfortunately, the general populace does not know anything about spiritual life or the spiritual world. The spiritual world is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 8, text 20. Padastasmatu bhavo nyo vyakto vyaktat sanatanaha yasa sarveshu bhuteshu nashyatsu navinashyati. Krishna says, yet there is another manifested nature which is eternal and is transcendental to this manifested and unmanifested matter. It's supreme and is never annihilated. When all the world is annihilated, that part remains as it is. Srila Prabhupada's translation of this verse indicates the difference between the spiritual world and the material world. It's a manifested nature. It has manifestation. It's tangible. But it's eternal. This world is also tangible. It's also manifest. But sometimes it's manifest and sometimes it's not manifest. The spiritual world is always there. So Prabhupada continues, thus there is a spiritual nature beyond this material world, and that spiritual nature exists eternally. Spiritual advancement means stopping material activities and entering into spiritual activities. This is the process of Bhakti Yoga. In the material world, the via media for sense gratification is mainly a woman. One who is seriously interested in spiritual life should strictly avoid women. Of course, the opposite is also true. If you're a woman, same thing goes. A sannyasi should never see a man or a woman for material benefit. In addition, talks with materialistic men and women are also dangerous, and they're compared to drinking poison. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was very strict on this point. He therefore refused to see King Prataparudra, who was naturally always engaged in political and economic affairs. The Lord even refused to see the king despite the request of a personality like Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, who was the Lord's intimate friend and devotee, not to mention senior, I might add. Sarvabhauma kahe, satya tomar vachan, Jagannatha shevak raja kintu bhaktottam. Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya replied, my dear Lord, what you've said is correct, but this king is not an ordinary king. He's a great devotee and servant of Lord Jagannath. Prabhu kohe tathapi raja kala sarpakar, kashtanari sparshe jaiche upaje bikar. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, although it's correct that the king is a great devotee, he is still to be considered a venomous snake. Similarly, even though a woman be made of wood, one becomes agitated simply by touching her form. Another important purport by Srila Prabhupada. Sri Chanakya Pandit has stated in his moral instructions, Tyaja Durjana Samsargam, Bhaja Sadhu Samagamam. This means that one has to abandon the association of materialistic people and associate with spiritually advanced people. Samsarga. Durjana Samsargam. This is all that's available in this material world at this point in time. Only association with rascals, So that we should give up. And what's the alternative? You have to do something. Bhaja sadhu samagamam. We should worship the company of devotees, actually is what this means literally. Bhaja sadhu samagamam. However qualified a materialist may be, he's no better than a venomous serpent. Everyone knows that a snake is dangerous and poisonous. And when its hood is decorated with jewels, it is no less poisonous or dangerous. However qualified a materialist may be, he's no better than a snake decorated with jewels. One should therefore be careful in dealing with such materialists, just as one would be careful in dealing with a bejeweled serpent. That means not a serpent made out of jewels, it means a serpent with jewels decorating its hood. Even though a woman be made of wood or stone, she becomes attractive when decorated. One becomes sexually agitated even by touching the form. Therefore, one should not trust his mind, which is so fickle that it can give way to enemies at any moment. Anybody know a verse about this? I'll give you a hint, from 5th canto. It's 5:11-17. Bhratravyam enam taradabhraviryam upekshaya dhyetitam apramattaha guror haresh charano pasanastro jahi vyalikam swayam atma mosham. That means the uncontrolled mind is the greatest enemy of the living entity. If one neglects it or gives it a chance, it will grow more and more powerful and will become victorious. Although it's not factual, it's very strong. It covers the constitutional position of the soul. O king, please try to conquer this mind by the weapon of service to the lotus feet of the spiritual master and of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Do this with great care. Just like we sing, Bandho moi Shabadana mate. In India, you see the traffic signs, Savadhan. Means careful. You have to be careful in India. So, in this purport, Srila Prabhupada quotes Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who used to say that to control the mind, what do? Beat it with shoes many times, just after awaking, and again before going to sleep. In this way, one can control the mind. This is the instruction of all the Shastras. If one does not do so, one is doomed to follow the directions of the mind. However, another bona fide process is to abide strictly by the orders of the spiritual master and engage in the Lord's service. Then the mind will be automatically controlled. The material mind is always accompanied by 6 durjanas. What does durjana mean? Enemies, rascals. What are the 6 friends of the mind that always accompany that mind? Sharadi, we say, when they put the Lord's feet on your head. It kills those 6 enemies. What are they? Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Mada, Moha, Matsarya. Or in today's verse, Srila Prabhupada mentions fear as one of them as well. So, this is here being referenced, this verse from 5th canto is being referenced in Srila Prabhupada's purport, which we're reading now. So, the mind is always accompanied by 6 enemies, namely Kama, Krodha, Mada, Moha, Matsarya, Bhaya. That is lust, anger, intoxication, illusion, envy, and fear. Raise your hand if you're free of all these. Yeah, so it's relevant information for us. We suffer from these things all the time. Sometimes we're overwhelmed by anger. Sometimes we're completely carried away by fear. Sometimes it's envy that attacks. Sometimes lust. So all these things, greed, illusion, etc. Although the mind may be merged in spiritual consciousness, one should always be careful in dealing with it, just as one is careful in dealing with a snake. One should never think that his mind is trained and that he can do whatever he likes. One interested in spiritual life should always engage his mind in the service of the Lord, so that the enemies of the mind, who always accompany the mind, will be subdued. If the mind is not engaged in Krishna consciousness at every moment, there's a chance that it will give way to its enemies. In this way, we become victims of the mind. Chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra engages the mind at the lotus feet of Krishna constantly. Thus, the mind's enemies do not have a chance to strike. Following Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's example in these verses, we should be very careful in dealing with the mind, which should not be indulged in any circumstance. That means even if we are liberated, we still have to distrust the mind. Otherwise, what's the purpose of this example? Maharaj Pratap Rudra is a pure devotee. He's endorsed even by personalities like Ramananda Roy. Raise your hand if you're better than Ramananda Roy. And Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. And still Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would not agree to see him. So, once we indulge the mind, it can create havoc in this life, even though we may be spiritually advanced. The mind is specifically agitated through the association of materialistic men and women. Therefore, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, through his personal behavior, warns everyone to avoid meeting a materialistic person or a woman. You may note that when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was discussing who is a devotee, who is not a devotee, who are the two kinds of Krishna abhaktas? One is the non-devotee, and the other one is a Stri Sangi, somebody who's attached to women. And in this material world, nowadays, it's 2023, that is the default. You just have to assume it's taken as granted. So we all have to rectify that, the mentality that has been created by socialization in this demoniac culture, in which we all just assume that life is meant to enjoy. And as Prabhupada says here, what did you say? The chief vehicle of sense gratification is woman, means the opposite sex generally. So these are very stern warnings. Now, what does Chaitanya Mahaprabhu say next? Akarara vibhetavyam strinam vishayanam api yathayaher manasaha kshobhas tatha tasya kriterapi. Just as one is immediately frightened upon seeing a live serpent or even the form of a serpent, so one endeavoring for self-realization should similarly fear a materialistic person and a woman. Indeed, he should not even glance at their bodily features. This is another quote Prabhupada points out in the purport from this same chapter of Chaitanya Chandrodaya Natak. It says text 24. In my edition, it's actually text 90. Not a big deal. Aiche bata punarapi mukhena anibe kaha jadi tabe amai ethana dekhibe. Bhattacharya, if you continue to speak like this, you'll never see me here again. Therefore, you should never let a request come from your mouth. Bhai paya sarvabhauma nija ghare gela vasai gya bhattacharya chintita haila. Being afraid, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya returned home and began to meditate on the matter, just as we should do. So I discussed text number 8 yesterday with Vaisheshika Prabhu. And he shared some of his insights, which I will pass on to you. Before that, I just wanted to note here the word used in text number 8, sandarshitam, sandarshanam. What does it mean? Complete, to have a complete look at something. In English, we have a distinction between two verbs. To see something is passive. To look at something, that's active. So in Sanskrit and in other Indian languages, we don't really make that distinction. But sandarshanam means samyak darshanam. Have a complete view. In other words, to indulge in looking at something or someone. This is what's being referred to here. So also the word nishkinchana is a point that Vaisheshika Prabhu brought up yesterday. Generally, nishkinchana we understand to mean akinchana, just like we say akinchana Krishna Das. And devotees should be without anything except for Krishna. Akinchana or nishkinchana means he has nothing. He has no stake in anything. He has nothing to gain or lose from anyone or anything. That's nishkinchana. Now, there are several verses in the 5th canto again of Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 18 in particular, if I'm not mistaken. For example, yasyasti bhaktira bhagavati akinchana is one, or we also have swastyastu vishvasya khala prasidadam, which refers to what kind of devotees? Ahaitaki, devotees who don't have any motive. So the Acharya is commenting there throughout all those verses that contain these words in that chapter. They all gloss the words as being synonymous. Nishkinchana or akinchana means ahaitaki, to be without any personal motive, no personal agenda, no motive, no purpose to fulfill. In other words, nishkinchana. That's one thing. Another thing is that Vaisheshika pointed out, Leela, Krishna's Leela is the antithesis of what is called in this verse today as Bhavasagara. Bhavasagar. Sagar means ocean, the ocean of material existence. And he particularly brought up the point of chapter 15 Bhagavad Gita, Urdhvamulam adha shakam ashvatham prahuravyayam chandansi yasya paranani yastam veda saveda veta. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it's said that there is an imperishable banyan tree that has its roots upward and its branches down, and whose leaves are the Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. So this tree is the material world, as Prabhupada points out in his purport. For someone who is engaged in fruitive activities, there's no end to the banyan tree. If you go to Balboa Park in San Diego, you'll see a huge banyan tree there. If you go to the Calcutta Botanical Garden, there's a banyan tree. How big is it? It's at least a square mile wide, one tree. So Prabhupada says, we wander. There's no end to the tree. As long as we're jumping from one fruitive activity to another, it's like jumping from one branch to another, and there's no end to it. You'll never get out, and you'll never figure out where you are either. It's a very confusing situation. The tree of this material world has no end, and for one who is attached to this tree, there is no possibility of liberation. So the process of extrication should be understood. Srila Prabhupada explains further. The tree of this material world is only a reflection of the real tree, of the spiritual world. That's he mentioned already. Parastasmat tu bhavonyo vyakto vyaktat sanatanaha. And the reflection of the spiritual world is situated on the platform of desire, just as a tree's reflection is situated on the water. Because the water is not stable, the reflected image of the tree is not stable. And because our desires are also not stable, therefore we can't see things clearly in this world. Our desires mess up the picture. This is what he's saying here. But one who wants to get out of this material existence must know this tree thoroughly through analytical study. Then he can cut off his relationship with it. This tree, being the reflection of the real tree, is an exact replica. Everything is there in the spiritual world. But the purpose of the Vedas is to cut down this reflected tree and attain the real tree of the spiritual world. Now, how do we do that? We do that by yoga. What kind of yoga do we practice? Bhakti yoga. So any yoga is always going to entail intense discipline. That's just the nature of yoga. Just like we hear in the Bhagavatam, Tivrena bhakti yogena means by intense bhakti. This is the idea. And so we hear in Bhagavad Gita, Sanishchayena yoktavyo yogo nirvinna chetasa sankalpa bhavan kanans tyaktva saravana sheshatah manasairendriya gramam vinayamya samantatah. Krishna says one should engage oneself in the practice of yoga with determination and faith and not be deviated from the path. One should abandon without exception all material desires born of mental speculation and thus control all the senses on all sides by the mind. Prabhupada writes, the yoga practitioner should be determined and should patiently prosecute the practice without deviation. One should be sure of success at the end and pursue this course with great perseverance, not becoming discouraged if there's any delay in the attainment of success. Success is sure for the rigid practitioner. And then what does he quote for us to back that up? He quotes from Rupa Goswami's Upadeshamritam. Those text 2 and text 3, both of them addressing this issue of mundane association versus spiritual association. And he says there, you have to be enthusiastic, you have to be convinced, and you have to be perseverant, and you have to follow everything. And you have to give up the bad association, and you have to model your life on the role models of the acharyas. That's hard to do. That's very tough. But it's possible. If we just continue, as Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita elsewhere, you just, what is that? Vairagnena chagrhyate. This mind can be grabbed or controlled by detachment and by constant practice, abhyasa. So the yogis know to what level we have to do this. Prabhupada says, the practice of yoga, especially bhakti yoga in Krishna consciousness, may appear to be a difficult job. But if anyone follows the principles with great determination, the Lord will surely help, for God helps those who help themselves. So, Vaisheshika Prabhu was pointing out yesterday, he was reading Yoga Sutra. Not something I would recommend in general, but he's such a personality that he can do that. And there it's described in part 2, text number 16. We hear that the yogi's perception becomes as sensitive as the surface of the eye. Is the surface of your eye very sensitive? Little tiny piece of dust gets in your eye, you're going to feel it acutely. It's very disturbing. What to speak of just extremely, very fine-tuned instrument, this eyeball. I think the scientists are saying that also. Just very, very difficult to figure out how this thing is made. But a yogi's perception becomes that sensitive. The eye is the most sensitive organ in the body, if you want to call it as such. The yogis employ such sensitivity in avoiding what he's called here is hladani samskar. Hladani samskar. Hladani means happiness, actually, enjoyment. Here in the yogic context, it doesn't mean hladani shakti. That's a different thing. It means mundane happiness. And all the impressions that mundane experiences stamp on our heart. It's like when you print a book in India, prathama samskarana, dvitiya samskarana. It means impression, addition, they say. So we practice bhakti yoga, but we practice very carefully, and we have to practice to this degree. This is all off of this verse, chapter 6, verse number 24. in which Krishna mentions that. So, Srila Prabhupada's purport says that this determined effort has to go into avoiding bad association also. Otherwise, he would not have quoted from Upadeshamritam to that effect. Sangatyagat sato vrite. We have to avoid bad associations in this way. We've already quoted from the 5th canto about how you cannot trust your mind. And here it's mentioned women, the opposite sex in general. Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila, chapter 22, text 89 and 90, which is the same thing as Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, chapter 31, texts 35 and 36. What is it? Natathasya bhaven moho bandhaschanya prasangatah yoshit sangat yatha pungso yatha tat sangi sangatah. It means the infatuation and bondage which accrue to a man from attachment to any other object is not as complete as that resulting from attachment to a woman or to the fellowship of men who are fond of woman. Tat sangi sangataha. These two things are always mentioned. Why is that? Krishna abhakta ar. Stri sangi. Stri sangi eka sadhu. Krishna abhakta ar. To be a materialist is one thing, but even to be a devotee, if he's attached to women or, as in this context, politics, pound, shilling, pence, this is kingly life. This is why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was acting in this way. He would not entertain this interview with the king, even though the king was endorsed by such great personalities, just to show us how important this has to be taken. Prabhupada writes in his purport to this verse, only in one order of life, the householder ashram, is there license to mix with women under restricted conditions. In other words, attraction for woman's association is the cause of material conditional life. It's not that women are the cause. Women are good. Men are also good. Women plus men, not good. Ever. This is the point. And the attachment that is impressed, is, to use this word again, hladini samskar, which is created as a result of that association, it's hard to get rid of. It's very hard to wash that out of the mind. It's like burnt into your microchip, you can say. It's a very strong impression. This is the point of this verse that he's telling us. There's nothing so entangling, nothing so bewildering as indulging in this association. Particularly in modern days, it's all about sex life. It's number 2 concern, at least here in America. In the Western world in general, I don't normally quote Narayan Maharaj, but he said something very nice, at least once, which is that Indians are more attached to money than Westerners are to illicit sex. How's that for killing 2 demons with 1 disc? So, people have different anarthas, but this in this hemisphere and in the modern day and age, it's all about sex life and the impressions that sex life create on our mind, and it's very contaminating, very bewildering thing. So that's where we have to put our attention. Separate, detach, and conquer the mind by either beating it or by burying it in the instructions of the spiritual master. We're so busy engaged in service to Lord Krishna under the direction of Srila Prabhupada. We have this opportunity now with Rath Yatra. There's no time for any Maya. There's no scope. This is the idea, to be completely engaged in this way. Now, finally, Prabhupada has mentioned in his purport that regarding never trusting the mind, and I'm going to end here because it's late, Srila Prabhupada has warned us about this. Even if one is spiritually advanced, still you should not trust the mind. That was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's advice. One god brother told me that he went to the most favorable god brother of Srila Prabhupada, Puri Maharaj, and he asked him frankly, what happened in the Gaudiya Math? How did they go wrong? So many highly qualified people, tell me, what is your idea about this? And he answered in one word, Puri Maharaj. He said, Adhikaru Ulanghana. Adhikaru Ulanghana. Those who speak Indian language will understand. They just overstep their own prerogative. Adhikar means prerogative. What you're qualified to do, what you're able to do, and what you're therefore allowed to do. It's a combination of both. If we overstep that, then we run into trouble. Swe swedhikare ya nishtha saguna parikirtitaha, Krishna tells Uddhava in 11th canto. To be situated in exactly what you're qualified for, your own prerogative, that is a quality. To try anything else is a flaw. Either you try more than you can do, or you settle with less than you can do. Either way, it's a recipe for falling down. So this is what generally leads us to embrace the wrong kinds of association, to indulge in looking at the wrong things, because Shakespeare says it begins with the eyes. What is that poem? He says, tell me, where is fancy bred? Or in the heart, or in the head? How begot? How nourished? Reply, reply. It is engendered in the eyes. Dies in the cradle where it lies. Let us all ring fancy's knell. I'll begin it. Ding dong bell. Shakespeare. In other words, when we look at the wrong thing or the wrong person, this is the beginning of the fall down. When we indulge in that process, just like internet, everybody knows what is the main use of the internet? Pornography. Such a misuse of human intelligence. So when we indulge in these things, then we're toast. We have no chance. And it all begins with trusting the mind, which means we have not properly estimated our own adhikar, which means we have not associated closely enough with sadhus, because the definition of a sadhu is that he engenders your trust such that you reveal your mind and inquire confidentially, and then he slashes, according to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Okay, so there's more to say. This is an infinite topic, but we're out of time, and we only got to 12 verses deep into this chapter. You had a question, please, Rameshwar Prabhu.
Or the form of a comment, if you would allow. Srila Prabhupada told us that he elevated his householder disciples to be greater than the sannyasi preachers in the Gaudiya Math that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had sent overseas, because they failed. When Prabhupada sent his Grihastha disciples to England, they conquered the world. They conquered the Beatles. So the verses that you have read are super important in terms of caution, but they also historically became a topic that was extremely misunderstood by our own internal sannyasi preachers.
Good point.
For more than a year or two, they traveled everywhere preaching against being in the temples, because the temples were allowed to have lady devotees living in them, and they were often managed by grihastas, and their preaching was, if you want to make more advancement, you leave the temples and just travel with us sannyasis. So this became a crisis, and we have to be careful to make sure history doesn't repeat itself.
Good point.
So what happened in 1976, at the height of this, Srila Prabhupada called the leader of the sannyasis, at that time it was Tamal Krishna Maharaj, into his quarters. He called me into his quarters as a leader of book distribution, and had us debate this issue in front of him. And my argument, which I don't want to speak for Maharaj, but my argument was, these are designations that we have transcended in the Hare Krishna movement. Otherwise, Prabhupada, why would you even have grihastas? And why would you even have ladies living in the temples? And since I was speaking on behalf of book distribution, I said, we go out, half the world's population is female. We're giving them books. And what happens when they want to join? The sannyasis don't have any solution for that if they're banning women. And you have invited God into all your temples. I gave all these different arguments. And so, in the end, Prabhupada did not like the extreme misinterpretation and took some drastic measures, which led to the opening of China. But that's another story. But our grihastas and our Matajis are empowered by Srila Prabhupada. He has brought them into the modern Hare Krishna movement that is transforming the world. That should not be forgotten. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, the point is that after Prabhupada says in his purport to 5.11.17 that you have to beat the mind, etc., etc., he says the alternative is to very strictly abide by the order of the spiritual master. Then you have protection. And that's exactly what happened with those devotees who went to London. They were very, very much Guru Nishtha. They were fixed in Prabhupada's order. They had a strong sense of purpose. And they were determined, and they were following, as the Upadeshamrita verses that he quotes describe. Therefore, they were successful. This is the point. Guru Mukha Padmavakya Chite Te Koryayika. Anything else? Yes. I'm sorry, Amala Bhakta Maharaj. Microphone. Maharaj, please.
Real quick. I noticed that the point was being made that in order to control the mind, we have to beat it. Like beat it and beat it and beat it until finally it succumbs and yields and surrenders. However, what are we beating it with? A stick, a stone, with a holy name.
Yeah.
That's what we beat it with. Nothing else. Because that is beating it with God, and God can only completely absorb itself, himself, in the mind, and therefore that gives us protection.
Thank you. And one Mataji in the back had a question also.
Hare Krishna, thank you for the beautiful lecture. I'll be fast. I just had a realization I wanted to share. It's attachment to material life is giving your consent to be bitten by that poisonous snake. But attachment to spiritual life is what allows us to maintain our autonomy, because you cannot have consent with addiction.
I was going to mention that Patanjali is criticizing Hladini Samskar, the impressions created by our material enjoyment, but devotees also have a different Hladini Samskar. That is the impressions created by Srimati Radharani and her servants. That's what's going to carry us across. Okay, thank you all very much. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.